Hey everybody, I'm Scott Graham, the new Extension Entomologist with Auburn University Alabama Cooperative Extension System. So I am responsible for cotton, soybeans, and peanuts. So Dr. A is still around. He's kind of been helping mentor me through my new responsibilities here with peanuts. So we're kind of in the process of transitioning those responsibilities over to me. Really appreciative of the help and mentorship he's given me this past summer, trying to kind of get my feet wet with peanuts and figure out kind of what all we're dealing with here in Alabama. So today I wanted to take a little bit of time just to talk some about just some considerations moving into 2021, look at some different pests that we may run into, and kind of talk about how we can most economically manage those pests. All right, so first I thought we'd just kind of look at a general map of kind of where peanuts were planted in Alabama in 2020. This is information from the USDA FSA. No surprise really to everyone that we're primarily planting our peanuts in the southern part of the state, and the wiregrass is really the dominant area where we're planting them. But we do have some fields of peanuts across the state. So like I said, to me, just really interesting to see where our production is and understanding the differences in growing conditions and pest pressures and things that may come about depending on where our farms are located. So a couple of topics that are really going to come on over and over throughout this presentation are scouting and only treat when needed. Now, we have a lot of pests that are secondary and induced pests, and not always super consistent. So it's important that we don't create problems for ourselves, but at the same time, we can't be scared to pull the trigger. When we've got a threshold level of pests in the field, we do still need to spray. So a couple of the things that we'll walk through in this presentation are snails, thrips, or defoliating caterpillars, spider mites, lesser cornstalk borers, and burrower bugs. So before we talk about the pests, it's always important whether you're a grower that scouts his own field, or a consultant or a scout or an agri-field man, whoever it is. If you're walking through a peanut field, you need to have a plan. So this is a slide from Dr. A that I borrowed, just looking at what our scouting calendar is. So we know if we're in the field in May, we need to be looking for thrips, so we don't need to be looking for for soybean looper, for example. They're not going to be in the field at that time. So it's always important, anytime we're in the field, we know what main pests we're scouting for, but at the same time, we do need to observe for other pests and look around for spider mites starting to build, things like that. So we're always paying attention, but we have a plan of, we know these are the main pests that we're going at this time. So one of the first ones we'll talk about are slugs and snails, and really I want to focus on snails. These are pests that are typically worse in cool, wet years, conditions that are very conducive for slug and snails to thrive. These are some images here from down in Florida, just across the border there in Baker, I believe, from this past spring. And you just see the number of snails that were left over from the year before, and this particular field was having problems with snails again. And that's one thing that we think maybe they kind of tend to happen in the same fields over and over. Unfortunately, there's really not a lot we can do about this problem. We can kind of identify some factors, like I said, cool, wet years, they're probably going to be worse. Reduced and no-till systems or cover cropping systems, they're probably going to be worse in those cool, wet years. So potentially a little light tillage, something like that, can kind of turn them over, mechanically kill them, expose them to adverse conditions, kill them that way. There are some baits available, particularly for slugs. They are pretty expensive. They're hard to put out, and they're not overly effective. And they're pretty good. I mean, you can maybe get 60, 75, potentially 80% control, but at the cost of what it is to put these baits out, and how difficult they are to put out and calibrate and those kinds of things, really probably not worth the price. Obviously, these snails are coming in early in the season, and then they're causing issues for us at harvest. So, we really just got to identify these situations where we think snails may be a problem, and potentially do some light tillage over those fields before we plant, obviously, because once the peanuts are in the ground, we really can't do a lot of soil disturbance. So next are thrips. Now these are one of the most consistent pests we have of peanuts in Alabama. As soon as those plants emerge and weedy hosts and things begin to die, they're going to infest those fields. Typically, we think of thrips pressure as being worse earlier in the season than with our later planted peanuts, and part of that's just environmental conditions and how well the crop's growing and things like that. As far as the tomato spotted wilt virus, our general recommendation is to try to plant a peanut variety that is resistant to tomato spotted wilt virus. You can see those different recommendations for some of those varieties in our IPM guide. Twin row planting is something that is shown to reduce tomato spotted wilt virus incidence, as well as strip tillage. So those are some things that we can do to help reduce that, because even some of these resistant varieties may still show a little bit of symptoms and things from tomato spotted wilt virus. We have some at-plant insecticides. These are very important whether or not you've got a resistant variety. We need to manage thrips at plant, whether that be something like 4-8 or AgLogic. Now, 4-8 does have some ability to reduce tomato spotted wilt virus. AgLogic and imidacloprid really don't. One thing about imidacloprid is it's got some anti-feeding properties on these thrips. So in a way, they taste it. It doesn't taste good, so they pick up, move, and go feed somewhere else. So that could be something that potentially could cause the virus to spread even more if you're not planting a resistant variety or one with low resistance. So that's just something to consider as far as our at-plant insecticides. And looking through all the literature and things, one of the big recommendations is we don't need to make foliar sprays for thrips, at least very often. I just, kind of looking through and thinking back to some experiences I had in kind of north central Mississippi in graduate school, and we had a student whose project was looking at the interaction of herbicide injury and thrips injury on peanuts. And so you see an image here of showing the percent canopy cover where we have no Valor herbicide, pre-herbicide, and where we have Valor plus water. So a lot of stunning from that pre-emergent herbicide. You see a 34% canopy cover where there's no herbicide, and 9.43% where there is a pre-emergent herbicide. So when we looked at, we're at 85% where there's no Valor, 71% canopy cover where we had that stunted injury. So then when we look at, what happens if we spray thrips on top of that, we actually get that percent canopy coverage up. They had orthene sprays of 1 application, 2 applications, or 3 applications. Really no difference there. But it is an increase in our percent canopy coverage. And part of that, if we think about it, if the foliage that's our older foliage is stunted and kind of beat up a little bit from the herbicide injury, when that new foliage comes out, that's where those thrips are going to go. They like to feed on emerging foliage while it's still kind of furrowed up. So it kind of stands to reason that they're going to do damage there, and maybe we're not getting quite as much help out of those older stunted leaves. So just some things to consider. Should I spray? Should I not spray thrips? You see this graph here with our different numbers of thrips per plant when applications went out at 3, 6, and 9, and really between that 3 and 6 number was where they had their highest yields and highest return on investment. So your crop condition is going to definitely play a role in this. Are your plants stunted and stressed, or are they vigorously growing? What was your planting date? If you're earlier planted, you're probably going to have delayed growth and more opportunity for stunted plants to be hurt and thrips to compound that damage. What's your weather conditions like? It may not be worth it to try to spray thrips. If you're starting to see spider mites in the field, you may just live with that thrips injury. And really what I think it ultimately comes down to are where are you in the state? Is earliness as important of a factor? Because that's one of the big things is we're really just kind of seeing a delay in maturity. Well, if we're on the southern part of the state where we've got a much longer season, it may not be that big of a deal. But if you're a peanut grower in the northern part of Alabama, where you're more similar to that north central Mississippi area where this research was done, and your season's not quite as long as it is in the wiregrass, you may see a little benefit if you've got stunted or stressed plants. You may see a benefit from spraying thrips. And one last thought about thrips is this thrips model from North Carolina State University. It's actually developed for cotton, but we can pretty easily use it for peanuts. It just kind of uses weather predictions and weather patterns to predict when thrips are going to move off of weedy hosts and infest crop fields, and then it can kind of match up how well the thrips will be reproducing and growing based on the predicted weather patterns. So that's something to consider to look at as well, and you can see what your relative thrips injury would be compared to your planting dates. So next, one of the really fun things about peanuts is there's a lot of different critters that you'll find in a peanut field at any given time. And this slide here that I've kind of modified from Dr. Ray really kind of makes that point. There's a lot of different caterpillars that may be found in a field. The redneck peanut worm there, I was told when I was an undergrad student at Mississippi State, I was told that was our school mascot was the redneck peanut worm. I don't know what they were trying to tell us there with that. But really a lot of different things can be in the peanut field. Fall armyworms, early in the season, tobacco bud worms, corn earworms can be in there. But really the big three that we're going to see probably, and really the big two that we need to be worried about at any given time are soybean loopers and velvet bean caterpillars, and the green clover worm may be in that mix as well. So here's a slide just kind of looking at when are peanuts susceptible to defoliation, and really what you see is once we get around that 50 days after emergence, that's really when we start to see issues. Now this was some work again at Mississippi State that I was a part of in graduate school, and this is really worst case scenario. We hand pulled 100% of the leaves in plots at those different days after emergence timings that you see there. So this is not, if we have 5% defoliation at 50 days after emergence, we're not going to see, a 2,000 pound decrease in yield. We're probably not going to see any, but at 100% defoliation, that's where we saw damage. So this is just kind of looking at how worried do we need to be about early season defoliation, how worried do we need to be about, mid and late season defoliation. So thankfully, generally speaking, controlling these caterpillars really isn't too difficult. Most of our labeled insecticides do a pretty good job. Pyrethroids, insect growth regulators, samosas. Now, if you're dealing with the soybean looper, that's when we're probably going to need to make that shift, get away from some of those more generic insecticides and move to our newer chemistries, the diamides or an Intrepid Edge, Previthon, Besiege, products like that, or really if we've got the soybean looper, that's when we're going to need to make that shift. Our threshold is 4 larvae per row foot. Potentially we could probably ease up on that a little bit the later in the season we get when there's more foliage. Peanuts have a lot of leaves. If you've ever hand defoliated a 50 row foot of peanuts, it takes a long time to do some damage on those things. So potentially we can maybe go 6 or 8 per row foot the later in the season that we go. And really the key is properly identifying and scouting and monitoring. Like I said, it's going to keep coming up. If we've got the green clover worm on the left there with 3 pro legs, we can kill that with just about anything labeled. If we've got the soybean looper on the right with the 2 pro legs, that's going to, as I mentioned before, that's going to cause a shift to the more expensive chemistry. And really our problem here is You know, we can spray a diamide on the green cloverworm and kill it dead really easy, but that's going to cost us $8–10 more than it should have. And if we make that pyrethroid spray on the soybean looper, it's really not going to touch it. We're going to waste that $2 or $3, $4 and potentially make our situation worse moving forward. So properly scouting and identifying what defoliating caterpillars we have in the field is very important for economic reasons and, you know, just basic insect control reasons. And part of that is thinking about, you know, things like spider mites. You know, we don't want to be spraying a lot of pyrethroids, acetates, things like that if we don't have to, because spider mites are likely going to be in the field at least at low levels throughout the season, particularly again if we're in reduced till, no-till cover crop situations. If we don't get a good burn down, if we don't burn down early enough, you know, we kind of create that green bridge where pests, and in this case spider mites, may go from our cover or our weeds and move right onto our peanuts, and then they're just kind of sitting there waiting to explode. And another point about that is, you know, historically we've always thought of spider mites starting on field edges and field borders and moving their way into the field. Well, now with this shift that we've really gone to of reduced tillage and stuff, which is good, but these spider mites are starting out in the middle of fields. So, you know, we've really got to walk our fields and be looking. Hot, dry weather is when we really expect these things to explode and start reproducing and causing damage really fast. We do have just a few treatments available. Comite 2 is one, Portal is another one. This is a product that we just got a supplemental label for this past season, so we had it available to us in 2020, and we'll have it again in 2021. So we do have another option, but really the best way to manage spider mites is to not give yourself spider mites, right? So, you know, we think about things like three-cornered alfalfa hoppers, which are always hopping around fields, and particularly on those borders, and we really feel like they're doing damage for us, but most of the time they're not going to cause us any damage. You know, we don't like seeing them. You know, we see the girdling and things, and we feel like they're eating us up. Well, most of the time, if we run out and spray pyrethroid, we kill them. They just reinfest the field from borders again. Cause us to think our spray didn't kill them, so we spray them again a week later, and it's been hot and dry, and boom, we've got spider mites. So, you know, not spraying non-pests and not spraying pests until they reach threshold are really some of our best ways to manage spider mites. And one other thought there about, you know, when to treat, it's really going to require some professional judgment, both from you and your scout, and really from the weatherman. You know, if we've got a hot, dry forecast for the next 7, 10, 14 days, it may be worth it making an early application. If they're predicting, you know, a lot of rain and things like that, maybe we can hold off and delay or even avoid making that insecticide or that miticide application. So a little bit of professional judgment on when to pull the trigger or if to pull the trigger on spider mites. So lastly, a couple more to talk about. Lesser cornstalk borers. These are really a major threat for us in our hot and hot, dry conditions, just like spider mites. There are going to be issues when we have skippy stands. We don't get good stand establishment early in the season. Those are kind of areas they're going to go to. Really need to be watching our late planted dryland fields. Really seem to be kind of a major attractant for these pests, and fields with conventional tillage. These are one of the few pests that actually reduced till, no-till makes things better for us as far as an insect standpoint. Conventional till fields tend to have more issues with lesser cornstalk borers. You know, sometimes this is a pest where our a rain can be just as good as an insecticide treatment. So that's one thing to consider. You know, if you don't have rain in the forecast, Prevathon, Dominant Besiege are products that provide good control. I've got the granular chlorpyrifos there, and hopefully we'll continue to have that treatment available for us. But one thing to think about is that, like I said, that's a granular, so it's going to need to be put out and then rained in. Well, if we're in a situation where we can't get rain or we can't irrigate, we're probably not going to be able to get that chlorpyrifos watered in and get it used. So it may not be a situation to be able to use chlorpyrifos. Our threshold is when we see fresh damage and at least 30% infestation in the different spots in the field that we evaluate looking for lesser cornstalk borers. So lastly, the burrower bug. So this is a pest that we've been trying to do research on, trying to figure this guy out. Again, it's going to be worse in hot, dry years, and this one's worse in reduced tilled fields. Typically, from what I understand, is we're looking at fields if we've had burrower bug issues in the past. They're more likely to have issues in the future. So those are fields that we're kind of trying to key in on. Here's an image from Dr. Mark Abney at the University of Georgia showing the damage that they do. Pitting is what we call it. It can lead to decreased yields, lower grades, higher peroxide levels, higher aflatoxin contamination, things like that. So it's very important that we control this pest. If it's in the field, chlorpyrifos is really our only option. It's most effective when we put it in at plant or at pegging. So just hope we can get the good rain situations to be able to get it incorporated into the root zone there. Tillage is another option, but again, that's one we can only do prior to planting. So if we feel like when we're pegging, we feel like we've got some issues with burrower bugs, it's too late to do tillage, obviously. Our threshold for this one is 2 bugs per 3 row foot at the pod stage. And identification is very important. There are other burrower bugs, insects that look similar. You see the one here that I've got the red X through, the white margin burrower bug, and you see it's black with the white lines around it. So it's important that we understand what this insect looks like and don't spray a non-pest. So just some of our take-home points from today. There's going to be a lot of different critters in a peanut field, and it's important that we properly scout and identify these pests or these insects when we see them. Some may be welcome, some may not be welcome. Knowing which fields are at risk of which pest is important. So we're knowing our conventionally tilled fields are at a higher risk of a lesser cornstalk borer, and our no-till fields are at higher risk of a burrower bug. So it's important that we make those considerations pre-plant when we're making our plans for the season. Scouting and identification again is critical. Only spray when we need to, but don't be scared to pull the trigger when it's time to go. We need to go and kill those bugs and keep them from causing any yield loss. So thank you very much for joining in today and watching this presentation. We'd just like to real quickly plug some of our information, our locations where we get things out to you guys. The Alabama Crops Report newsletter, the Alabama Peanut IPM Facebook page, the Alabama IPM Communicator e-newsletter, all ways that we get information out. We're working on a podcast that should be coming this spring, the Alabama Crops Report podcast, which will be kind of a conversational style interview with regional agents and specialists across the state and probably across state lines as well. Just trying to get a good feel of what's going on in our area and get the word out of what we're seeing, what we're hearing, and what we can do about it. And then obviously our Peanut IPM guide, we have all our up-to-date recommendations and thresholds and things like that. So you see my contact information there. Please don't ever hesitate to call or shoot me a text or an email or something if I can ever be of any help. I look forward to hearing from you guys and working with y'all in the future. Thank you very much.